medieval history and literature are so often sets of contradictions where you're like, well, how do you venerate women and specifically the life-giving role of women? How can you hold that so high and yet have such a negative view of women's capacities for understanding?
We still have that very complicated relationship with women in our culture where we have this like over-sexualized, like porn version of women, and yet this like very feminist, like powerful, idealized version of woman.
The motherhood imagery felt particularly appropriate for medieval people because when you were pregnant, as a woman, you were staring down the very real possibility of your death, and that irony was not lost on them, and that significance of it in comparison to the cross was not lost on them.
The most common objection people have to belief in God is suffering.
Yes.
So,
which would have been unintelligible to medieval people. They would have been like, yeah, we have bodies, we're all dying.
My name is Simone Leone, and welcome to Meaning Making Machines. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm so excited to be interviewing Grace Hamman. Grace is a medievalist. She's a scholar, a writer, a speaker. She also has a great podcast called Old Books with Grace. And I wanted to talk to her because I read this book she wrote over Christmas, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, and it introduced me to, I guess, medieval people in general, how they thought about religion, how they thought about Christ. I was really fascinated with what she had to say. And we speak a lot about just like the medieval mindset, the medieval relationship to spirituality, religion, power, the church, and what they might think about us today, and just the conflicts we have with our modern sensibilities in fully understanding people of the past, which is something that I'm personally very interested by. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to Grace Hamman. Grace, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really, really happy to have you here. I actually read your book. I devoured it in probably like a day and a half this Christmas season, and I just absolutely loved it. So I'm really, really grateful to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate being here.
Yeah. So you just, I don't know if you're able to share, but I know you just get back from like a big research trip. Can you share a little bit about like what you were doing and what artifacts you were uncovering?
Oh yeah, no, I don't know if I'm quite fancy enough to be uncovering artifacts, but it was really great. I went primarily to learn more about medieval anchorites, so people who took vows to stay in a cell, usually attached to a church, mostly women, but some men as well. And Julian of Norwich being kind of the most famous one that we talk about today, who I talk about in the book. And so, that life is so hard to envision for us in modernity that I went to go and look at some of the surviving cells. There aren't very many. Look at some of the literature around it. So I did some library time, and that was awesome. And traveled kind of all over the place on this wild goose chase after anchorites. So that
cool.
was what I did. Yeah.
Why were they mostly women who decided to do that, or was it just like the custom, or why was that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's one that we can only really speculate about. But I think part of it is that men had more options if they wanted to live a vowed religious life. They could also be hermits and so the hermit life was a fairly popular is probably too strong of a word, but a choice for men who wanted to pursue a life of solitary prayer. And so there were many hermits in the Middle Ages. They often did public work like caring for bridges or roads. And so they were out and about, and they still lived this life of solitude devoted primarily to prayer, but they also were able to move around and do all this stuff. And so for women in those days, that just wasn't necessarily like the safest option. There were some women hermits, but I think that was highly unusual. And so for women who didn't feel called into a vocation at a convent as a nun, but who did want to live this life of solitary prayer, the anchorite option was kind of the best option for people. And it was still, we think of it as very isolated because you're like, oh my gosh, you're living in this one room for the rest of your life. You've promised to never leave. Like that's really crazy. But for many of them, especially the ones who were at their own parish church, vowed to their own parish church, they were kind of the center of communal life in a lot of ways, the prayers for their community, and so this was a position that was very respected, and definitely not for everybody, but a lot of women who were lay women or who had been married before and whose husbands died took this path as a sort of root of solitary prayer that then you were also embedded in your community. So
Yeah. I know it's really interesting, and when I read about these women, I think I I just think that would have been torture, but I also find it so fascinating.
I know. I
Yeah.
know. It's like it's so hard for us to imagine today. And I think it was hard then as well, but it was also a much more settled culture. People didn't move around as much in general. So I feel like it's less like totally crazy to
Yeah.
them than it is to us. But
I
yeah, it's wild.
I guess you're right. It's yeah, more of the inner journeying was more common than the
That's
outer.
right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you, what made you fall in love with medieval times and want to study medievalism? Like what drew you to it in the beginning, and why have you stuck with it?
Yeah. I like any sort of path of obsession, there's a lot of different answers I could answer to this
Yeah.
because it's one of those things where you're like, oh, all of these things converged in this interest. But I will say, for me, it was primarily through literature. So my PhD is in English, it's in Middle English contemplative writing and poetry. And I loved the history of the English language so much. I found it really fascinating. I've always loved history and words. And so, learning Middle English, those interests kind of came together. And, and then I was super interested. I grew up in this, I had gone always to public schools. That was awesome. Like no shade on them at all. But I had never, I grew up, I still am a Christian, and I had never gotten to look at that like in a school setting.
Mhm.
So this was fascinating to me that you really can't read Middle English or any kind of medieval literature without entering into questions about God and who He is and what's going on with the spiritual life. And so that was really exciting to me that I was like, oh my gosh, here we are. And you can't really avoid those questions. You have to grapple with them because otherwise you're going to be kind of missing the point of a lot of Middle English literature. And so the convergence of all those interests, then I just kept going and eventually got my PhD and it was just a funny little journey.
That's very cool. And yeah, I think it's interesting. Something that happened when I was reading your book around Christmas, New Year's. This New York Times article came out. I don't know if you saw it, but they were like trends for 2025. And at the top of their list was everyone's going to become interested in medieval times, like how last year was all about the Roman Empire. Like this year is supposed to be all about medieval times. And I thought that was so interesting. And it happened while I was reading your book. Someone who isn't really an expert on this period in history, but I just became fascinated with it because of just like how like there's something very strange about medieval people. Like they're just like very weird, and I like that, but I also just I felt that there was something about the way in which they were very spiritual, and we're just like breathing that in, but also their relationship to suffering. I don't know. There was just like an art. Oh, art. That's what I was going to say. Medieval art and architecture is like the most beautiful to have ever existed. So I was just like, who are these people who are so weird, yet full of suffering, and yet creative, so much beauty that still exists?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's in a lot of ways they um feel really different from us and
Mhm.
from our like cultural emphases. And so I think that draws us in. We're like, oh, you aren't scared to suffer in a lot of which I feel like I know I'm very scared to suffer, and I
Yeah,
feel
me
like
too.
culturally we are terrified of like any of that. And then combined with this sense, as you point out, this the architecture and the art where they were like anything you can make beautiful, you should make beautiful. And we live in such a utilitarian society today that's becomes immensely attractive. I think um, I just love that feature of the medieval era is that you have these ordinary things, like a door or whatever, something so
Yeah.
basic. And if it can be made beautiful, they will want to do that. And I love that feature about the medieval era for sure.
Oh, yeah, me too. I think I that's like the problem I've always felt with modernity and why I've like gravitated towards old things, and it's not because they're old, but it's just like this relationship to beauty that feels kind of lost in our culture that I mean, just to think about the medieval artwork and how also it was so it's depersonalized in a way. I think if you want to be an
Mm.
artist today, it's
Hmm.
like very much about your identity and who you are and who, like creating this ego as a personal brand. And I mean, I think a lot of these artists and artisans, like a lot of them are probably lost to history or I mean, what do you know about like the medieval relationship to art and artistry?
No, I think you're right. I think that one of the features of that era that strikes us as highly unusual is that, especially in literature, you have some authors and poets that you know who they are, and especially the ones who are like in spiritual authorities, so like, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux or those guys who were producing things for a very particular audience of their
Hmm.
brethren that they were leading. But so frequently in medieval art and literature, it is anonymous. It was
Yeah.
just created and given. And that feels very unusual to all of us today who are like, I want credit for what I've done.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's totally wrong. I think there's a lot of good there, but it's a it is correcting this sort of it's a communal impulsive gift rather than an ego impulse of see what I can do. Look at this amazingness that I've
Yeah.
done.
And it's kind of ironic because I think of the medieval artists as some of the greatest like to have ever lived. Like the things that they're created are like beyond comprehension.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anyone who's stepped inside some of the medieval cathedrals in Europe can recognize that
Yeah.
immediately, where you're like, what is this space? This space, every inch of it has been thought about and like lavishly um loved and creativity poured out on. And then you're like, and it was some random stonemason that we have no idea. So
Yeah. I know. It's completely incredible and I mean I try to think about that as, like as an artist too, there's like that level of dedication and craft and yet being okay with never being known for it. I think it's just yeah, it's something totally antithetical to us today. Um so I'd love to talk a little bit more about the book too. Like you in the book you walk through a bunch of different archetypes of Jesus through a medieval lens, which I mean I thought a lot of them were really beautiful. A lot of them were like strange, but I mean, did you have a hard time choosing just a couple to dive deep into? Were there more that didn't end up in the book?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, and some of them, um, I part of the thought process of choosing the ones that I chose was that some
Hmm.
of them I wanted a mix of familiar and foreign because I think it's nice to have both where you're like, yeah, I've heard of this
Yeah.
before. This is a way in, and then also the things that are more of a stretch. So Jesus as a judge is a prominent theme in the New Testament, or Jesus as a lover is a long theme. He talks about himself as a bridegroom in the Gospels. These are very familiar, even if we don't think about them or spend much time with them. We're like, that's a
Yeah.
pretty standard image. And then you have ones that are a lot stranger and more medieval specific. So Jesus as a knight, for instance, where you're like, oh, that's kind of strange. Or Jesus as a mother, which is actually has scriptural roots, but it's something that is very startling to us. And so I tried to kind of keep that in mind. That being said, there were so many things, so many directions I could have gone. So more of that, the imagery that we'd be more familiar with. So, like Jesus as a shepherd, there's a ton
Mm.
of art around the lamb or the shepherd that was a very popular scriptural and historical theme. And then uh, there were some, more I kind of stuck with mostly human related imagery, but there's some like a vine, for instance, which is from the Gospel of John, but there's a lot of vine imagery and
Mm.
vine poetry and um, artwork in churches that I could have really gone a lot more into. But just, yeah, lack of space
Yeah.
and, uh, and yeah, I did reflect on I probably should have done the baby imagery of Jesus just
Oh, yeah.
because medieval choices of how to paint babies are always very startling and a little off-putting. And so that was one that I thought about later that I was like, oh, I probably should have done a Jesus as the baby chapter, but that didn't ever happen. I didn't think of it. So
The one that was like the weirdest for me, I guess, because it was just, it felt so foreign to me, was Jesus as a mother and like his wound looking kind of vaginal in a lot of the images and like birth and also just this like very strange. I don't know how you wrote about it. It was almost like he was both male and female at the same time, or like he like they like there was a lot of like feminine imagery associated with him, which I found really
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, so this idea, this is one of the ways in which the medieval church can be fairly different from the modern church, is that they were a lot more comfortable with metaphor.
Hmm.
And so they weren't expressing the idea that Jesus was actually female or
Yeah.
had female anatomy. But what they were saying is, look at all this imagery that through Christ we are born again, or that he wants to gather us like a mother hen,
Mm.
chicks under his wings. And so they were really interested in um, picturing how you could portray this mothering quality of Jesus. And so they have this amazing a book that has it's called the Bible Moralise, and it has all these images where you pair Hebrew the Old Testament imagery with the New Testament imagery, and how they kind of open up each other. And so on one page there's Adam asleep and God is forming Eve out of his rib, out of his side. And
Hmm.
then on the facing page, there's this wild image of Christ on the cross, and he, out of his side, he is
Yeah.
giving birth to a little um, representation of the church. And so this idea of the cross as a place of birth and death, as a place of labor, just like childbirth was really compelling to them and made for some really interesting artistic
I know.
choices. Yeah.
Well, it's just interesting when you said that. I'd never made that connection before between like Adam and the rib and Eve forming the rib. And is that like the same location where Christ's wound?
That would have been what medieval people loved to see
Yeah.
imagery and representation of like foreshadowing basically everywhere. So all stories in the Bible they would relate back to the coming of the Messiah, and so they would have seen that Genesis imagery as absolutely a foreshadowing of the side wound of Christ and of his labor on the cross and the creative aspect of that, which is shocking, but also um, they didn't mind being shocking if it
Yeah.
illustrated their point. So
Yeah, no, I love it. Like at first when I was encountered that image, I thought, is it like that they diminished women so much that they couldn't have like they like put femaleness onto him because they like couldn't portray it on a woman. But then I started to see it differently, and even you referencing the mother hen line, I think that's like my favorite line from the Gospels because it's just so comforting
yeah,
in a sense, and like the way that like a mother, there's nothing as pristine and pure and comforting as like a mother's love towards a child. And but you also talk about in the book a little just the fact that misogyny, like really ugly misogyny, was very common during that time, and yet it
absolutely.
contrasts with this I guess celebration of motherhood and through Christ. How would you like make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point to that they were very, very uncomfortable with women and but at the same time, in some ways, the medieval church was also um, they just adored Mary. So they have this model of sort of ultimate power in women as
Mhm.
well. And they were deeply devoted to Marian adoration. And so medieval history and literature are so often sets of contradictions where you're like, well, how do you venerate women and
Yeah.
specifically the role of the life-giving role of women? How can you hold that so high and yet have such
Yeah.
a negative view of women's capacities for understanding? Very often, Eve was kind of fully blamed for the fall. They followed Aristotelian science, which stated that women were basically malformed
Yeah.
men, and
I hate
it's a
that one.
no, it's just it's awful, and that was all true also, and so it's that same complexity that you can point to today in us, where we go, well, why do we value these things and then also not act on that value or hold these conflicting viewpoints without reflecting, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about reading the past is that those places of conflict and tension are much clearer to us and they help us to self-reflect on how we do the same thing very frequently.
Yeah, it's interesting as you just said that I had this thought about how we still have that very complicated relationship with women in
We
our
do.
culture where we have this
Absolutely.
like over sexualized like porn version of women, and yet this like very feminist like powerful idealized version of woman, and we still have a hard time having like a normal vision of what womanhood
Absolutely.
is. Just, I mean, just like they did, even though we're kind of in the polar opposite camp.
Right. Ours
Yeah.
takes a different form, but it is that same where you're like, oh my gosh, there's an inherent contradiction in this,
Yeah.
and yet we have such a hard time um as a people or as peoples like being able to actually say that and then act on that, kind of trying to unravel that tension. And I think that's very similar to this medieval era of um oh, Mary, oh my gosh, the most, except for Jesus, the most important person who ever lived, a woman and fully female in her womanhood, and also we think women are stupid and weak. So
Yeah.
you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
It's very similar.
It's very similar. And then I also wanted to talk to you about like their beliefs around sex, because you were saying that they held virginity as the highest standard, whether, I mean, even whether or not you were married, if I understand
Oh,
correctly,
absolutely.
or
Yes.
celibacy.
Yes, and not just like in like, oh, you stay like not in a sort of modern day purity culture way of not just like, oh, you managed to not have sex until you were married. That's good. Good on you. But as a no, literally, if you are a virgin, you are closer to God and holier than anyone who is not a virgin. And that was
Yeah.
a pretty undisputed medieval philosophy. So,
But yet there's like these a lot of these popular writings about like Jesus as like a lover and like physical. So yeah,
yes.
so what is like what does that mean?
It's again, it's that
Yeah.
same so there's two things going on here. There's that unresolved tension that we were just talking about, like with women,
Mhm.
where you're like, okay, you have this deeply complex reaction to sex that is troubling to say the
Mhm.
least. But also they as as I had mentioned earlier, they were so much more comfortable with metaphor, and they believed that every single sentence in the Bible had the possibility to be interpreted at least four ways. And so they would talk about a literal sense, but when you read the Song of Songs, you're like, why is this in here? And so opening that up to being like, this is about not just about the corporate church with God, but actually
Mhm.
about each individual soul with God, with Jesus, and um, this act of contemplative prayer, and how contemplative prayer is like the is like sex and resembles the intimacy and the longing of that act. And so again, to us, we're like, that doesn't make sense. You don't even like talking
Yeah.
about physical intimacy. But to them, they said, this is the closest kind of language we have to the kind of um, radical yearning that the soul and God, that it's a mutual longing, and then that even the physical aspects of that can be used to express something true and real about the particularity with which God loves each individual soul.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's that whole body of literature was extremely popular in the Middle Ages, probably one of the most popular representations of Christ in all the spiritual writings of the Middle Ages. And it feels very disorienting at first reading it for us today.
That's interesting that it was the most popular. Like, I wonder if you think it's because like people were very sexually repressed back then, or maybe that's my modern understanding of how we think about sex in this culture that you can be very sexually repressed. I don't even know. Like,
Yeah, part of it was that they were really, I think one suspicion that I have, I think I agree with you to some extent. I think some of it is that, oh, you're dancing around this thing that is tough, that
mhm,
you are as a celibate monk, you're sort
mhm.
of titillated by, but you're also like trying to be faithful and live out your vows. But I think the other thing is that um in the Middle Ages, this was a time where the church was at a height of power, the institutional church, and there wasn't sometimes there wasn't this sense of the intimacy of God. And so I think this language spoke to a deep need of spiritual longing and understanding of, hey, um, this isn't impersonal. Salvation is not impersonal. It's not generalized. It's actually individual, and it's actually about your relationship with God, with Jesus. And so that particular language of intimacy is also similar to the motherhood imagery of Christ, which is also a language of intimacy. And I think that just in that time period and still today speaks to a very deep human need of our need to be
Mhm.
known in a very particular way as ourselves.
Yeah, and kind of in on earth in the only way like your mother can really know you truly and has like formed you in her body.
Yes, and
Yeah.
that both of those images are bodily images. I mean,
Yeah.
that's speaks to that particular form of bodily intimacy that are very different, obviously, but they share that you are truly known in this life, in this present body, even though both gesture towards something beyond death, ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, and that's I think that's like what I love about Christianity is just this like contradiction that I feel like our human brains can't really fully grasp. It's like, well, what is this relationship between the physical and the spirit,
Yeah.
and how is like Jesus both a human and God, and like in the spirit, and also just like even in the idea of the Eucharist, how can it be both? And we just like there's just like we have to be comfortable with that mystery, even though
Yes.
it makes me uncomfortable to not grasp it, and I constantly am trying to grasp it, but I can't.
Yes, well said. I
Yeah.
think that's also why they loved like images and metaphor so much because it helps you to move beyond this like literal concrete 2 + 2 = 4 sense and further into the mystery that is sort of uncapturable by language.
Yeah. And one other thing with the relationship to motherhood, and also this like very contradictory relationship to sex, do you think that that also had something to do with the fact that sex would have been so much more dangerous, like childbirth, like so many women died in childbirth, like women were constantly getting pregnant and having babies dying or them dying, and so like versus now, like it just maybe the relationship to the sexual act just felt a lot scarier and not. Yeah. Yeah, I want to go
I
into that.
definitely, no, I definitely think that's true. I think the motherhood imagery felt particularly appropriate for medieval people because when you were pregnant as a woman, you were staring down the very real possibility of your death. It was not an abstraction. And obviously, women still die today in childbirth, but compared to the frequency with which it happened in the past, I mean, um, some of the and then um, some of the studies on this suggest that potentially um, up to what like a women faced like a quarter chance of like dying in childbirth or like the beyond childbirth in certain times and places in medieval history depending on their access to healthcare and on the cleanliness of where
Yeah,
they
the
lived.
cleanly.
And
Yeah.
so it was an extremely real possibility that you were going to die in this act of giving life. And that irony was not lost on them. And
Hmm.
that significance of it in comparison to the cross was not lost on them. That this was Christ's life-giving activity in his death. And so it bore a very real resemblance to childbirth.
And can you speak about the medieval relationship with suffering and like spiritual closeness to God? Like, how did they view that in a way that's really different from us?
Yeah, this is something that I'm still thinking about a lot because I think this is one of the hardest things to understand for me, for us today, is um, this widespread acceptance of suffering as a particular way to be close to Jesus. And not that you would seek it out intentionally necessarily. Some did. Some, this was the era where some folks were like self-flagellating, whipping themselves or wearing hair shirts all the time or refusing to eat except for the Eucharist, all those kinds of behaviors that were like, oh, today. But this also, alongside that, was a time where people viewed suffering as you could participate in Christ's suffering on the cross, in your own suffering, and that actually Christ's suffering on the cross was a participation in every form of human suffering on earth. So you see in the book, I talk about the really famous Eisenheim altarpiece by the artist Matthias Grunewald, where he painted this crucifixion for a hospital in Germany, and it was for people who suffered from leprosy and other skin diseases. And he actually paints Jesus on this altarpiece to look like his wounds are that kind of um, skin
Yes.
disease, are a skin disease. And so that's a perfect window into this idea that when you are in any place of suffering and you look at Christ on the cross, he is sharing that that suffering with you, and you in some mysterious way are actually sharing in his suffering as
Mhm.
well. And so again, closer to suffering as childbirth imagery, where it's not futile or in vain, but
Mhm.
that there's something happening that could be happening, not always necessarily, but that could be happening spiritually, where you are drawing close to God in this place of pain. And so that took a lot of different forms, and some were less healthy than others, but it also gave this dignity to human suffering that I think sometimes we miss today.
Yeah, and it's interesting in today, like the most common objection people have to belief in God is suffering.
Yes.
So,
Which would have been unintelligible to medieval people.
yeah.
They would have been like, yeah, we have bodies. We're all dying. Like, how does that say anything
Yeah.
about God? So it's just really interesting to see the difference in how we approach what impedes us in a path to God versus what doesn't, and how like culturally contingent a lot of that is. It's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like betrays our belief in the human baseline should be happy and comfortable versus that. Yeah, back then I don't even know, would medieval people have seen someone whose life was so happy and comfortable, would they have seen it as impoverished in some way spiritually?
Potentially, I think it would depend on how that person was living, and were they only living to avoid pain? You know, was that
Yeah.
how they were making their choices? I think they would have seen that kind of life as very impoverished, spiritually speaking. I think one way of thinking about it was Julian of Norwich writes about this all the time throughout her book, and she talks about how necessary it is for us to fall so that we can see our human need and
Mhm.
turn to the beloved community of God and to God Himself. Because if we're not falling, as even little children fall as they learn how to walk, you know, if there's not this sort of built-in component to like look at how much you need other people, look how much you need God, then we're going to miss something really essential about the shape of life. And so
Yeah.
that's her sort of version of this idea.
Yeah. And I think you related it, did was this you that you related it to you had to take your daughter to the doctors? Am I remembering this
Yes,
correctly?
you are.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Now, this makes me think of this. Yeah, I'm a mom, so this image of Jesus as a mother and is interesting in that way, but I don't think you need to be a mom to appreciate it because we all have moms. So,
Mhm.
you know, but I had to take my daughter has asthma, and she was about 2 or 3, and I had to take her to the doctor because she was having an asthma attack, and she just the mask on her face just completely terrified her. And so she was fighting it, screaming. And I, from the perspective of a parent, am going, "Oh, you need this mask on your face because it's going to, if you don't get this breathing treatment, you could have to get admitted into the hospital, which would be worse, or even, you know, heaven forbid, further down the road, this could be really bad for you. Like you could potentially die from an asthma attack, as people used to do all the time." And so I have this vision of what you need in this moment of suffering, but she's so caught up in this moment of very real pain and suffering that she can't see beyond that. And so that was one of Julian of Norwich's ideas, is that sometimes in our suffering we just are so limited to this moment, which is understandable. We're
Mm.
terrified, but that there's this greater context around it of that we are not even aware of. And that's not always a universal, I think, but I think it's a very good image for a lot of what our suffering is looks
Yeah.
like in our just sort of daily lives, of like, okay, I have to do this small painful thing, like apologize, in order to have a fruitful relationship. You know, there's this and we're reluctant even to do a lot of those things. But again, different conceptions. There are so many different forms of suffering, and so it's hard to even talk about it as a blanket in this way. But that's one
Yeah.
particular way into thinking about it.
And yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that like greater acceptance of limitation because I don't know if you've seen this quote. I feel like I've seen it bouncing around the internet a little bit where people are saying that a medieval peasant is would be have been better psychologically equipped to handle our AI future than we are because they had such a greater like I don't know, maybe just understanding of the darkness of humanity and the dark like the just like the dark parts of things that we're capable of. I mean, have you heard that quote? I mean, what do you think about that?
No, but I think that's
Okay.
really funny. No, I do. I think there's a truth there in the sense that I think medieval people, broadly speaking, were fairly pessimistic about
Mhm.
human capacity, and were like pretty aware of sin and failure, and how they didn't really have a rosy idea of authority. And they submitted to it. That was just the way that they were like, yep, yeah, the king is the king. That's the way it is. I think for good and for ill, today we're much more optimistic about human capacity, and we
Mhm.
have a lot more. Well, I don't know. That could really be great instead of that sort of caution of um, okay, we've done some pretty bad things with science in the past 100 years that we just sort of blindly forged on. I mean, I think plastic is like a great example of
Oh
this, where you're
yeah.
like, oh, we made this thing that now is never going to decay, and now we're all getting sick from it. And we didn't stop to sort of take stock of how limited our understanding is of these things that we have no conception of. And so I think in that regard, yes, I think medieval people had a more pessimistic view, sometimes to a fault, but
Mm.
we could use a dose of that at times, of
Yeah.
not negative, but of let's be let's be careful with the ways that we use technology. Let's proceed with caution because we've really hurt each other and done some damage.
How do you think they would have felt about our relationship to I guess trying to just destroy our limitations?
I think they would have thought that it was hilarious. I mean, I think they would have been like, "You idiots." I mean, we all have that in us, of
Yeah.
course. I think every human in history has rebelled against their limitations.
Mhm.
Um, whether that is in relationship, in technology, on a nationwide or cultural wide level. You see it time and time again with empire, all of that. But I think that um, in that particular era of the church, at least not on a governmental level or not in that way, but on a personal level of like, hey, they were pretty good at remembering ashes to ashes, dust to dust,
Yeah.
and to recognize if you can't handle that about yourself and your own mortality, that's going to be a huge problem for you. Um,
And I guess they were just more faced with death
yes,
constantly.
constantly, and the inescapability of it.
Yeah. And I think there's some part of us and I'm very aware of this in myself, just like not having been around death, not having ever seen a dead body. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that probably would have been inconceivable to someone even in the fairly recent past. And perhaps that even amplifies my own fears around death.
Yeah. No, I think that's a point that a lot of historians have explored, is that we are really distant and sanitized from dying and death, and how that kind of has taken a toll on us psychologically and spiritually. And I think that's true. And I think the era I study, which is the very end of the Middle Ages, had just experienced the plague, the Black Death, as we call it now,
Hmm.
and kind of this extremely widespread mortality event, in addition to all the usual mortality stuff. And so they were, I think, keenly aware of the futility of resisting death in a natural sense. And then
Yeah.
also, I think a lot of our fixation on like anti-aging and stuff would have
Mhm.
been like, what? Like aging is natural and also like great, you made it into the
Yeah.
aging stage. Like that's pretty incredible. That is not to be taken for granted. So,
I think about that a lot, like our obsession with anti-aging and maybe how that like betrays like a certain like immaturity that we think like 20 or something is the ideal, and we look to like 20-year-old pop stars to give us wisdom and advice. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just interesting that we would that's like that's the ideal in beauty, that's the ideal in like just being a public figure and sharing your opinions about life and the world. And I think that's very interesting. Another way that they probably would have thought we were crazy, just like probably a lot of us would think they were crazy. Yeah. Something I also wanted to ask you about that I was thinking about in terms of just medieval times. I think a lot of people maybe glamorize it or demonize it based on the role of the church. And that was like when the church was, I think, the most powerful it ever was during medieval times, and yet and also the most corrupt. And like just the fact that Christianity has this really strange relationship with power. It was like the time when people were the most religious, and the church had the most power in society, and yet most people were completely powerless, like feudal peasants. And yet the whole story of Christ is about like relinquishing power and the role of humility. I mean, how do you think about these in terms of this like very unique time in history for Christianity?
yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's a very complicated time where you have these basically princes of the church. I mean, if
Mhm.
you were a bishop or an archbishop or a cardinal, um, or the Pope, you ruled basically like a worldly king or a duke or a prince, and you had an immense amount of power of earthly power in that way, as well as spiritual power within the administering of the sacraments and all that. And so it is I think the best way that I can think about it is that every era and time and place of the church, there are these blind spots
Mhm.
where you've kind of lost the plot. I think for us today, one of those potential spots is money. So like
Mm.
we live in such a wealthy society, and the way that we think about money, we have no questions whether or not it's ethical to just keep accumulating it. Whereas that would have been a preoccupation for Christians through almost every other era in history is, can you be a Christian and be super wealthy? Or like at the very least, what are your obligations when that happens? Whereas we don't have that many questions about that. And so for them, I think the related issue was power, where it was like, they viewed it pretty straightforwardly as like, yeah, the more power the church has, the more power God has. And we, of course, are like, oh, you really conflated yourself with God there. That was a weird move. And so you have people working against that, reforming in their own way in that time. So you have somebody like Saint Francis of Assisi, who was a reformer of the idea of what power was. Not only was he giving up his possessions, but he was thinking about what is the role of a priest or a vowed religious within community.
Mm.
You have the various reform movements in monasticism that are trying to figure that out. A lot of the writing of um, Jesus as compassionate or merciful, like in the mother image or the lover imagery, are dealing with that very idea where it's like, okay, the power of the church can't be authoritarian. So, what kind of spiritual power is a benevolent and merciful power? How does that look? So,
Mm.
these were coming out um, in kind of sideways questions, but overall, I think it was just a time where the church was fairly uncaring as to the results of what political power could do.
Do you think that the average medieval peasant, do you think in their mind that they were able to separate their spiritual path from the corruptions of the church, or would that have been something unthinkable with them, or how do you think they, like, a lot the average person would have dealt with that?
I think it's very hard to know what the medieval peasant would have thought because
Hmm.
so little of their life survives to us.
Yeah.
The artifacts we have from the Middle Ages are from the wealthy or from at least the upper middle class, to use an anachronistic term. But
Hmm.
um, peasant life is so mysterious to us because there's just, you know, just like today, the things that you save and that you keep are the valuable things. And so,
Hmm.
so much of just an ordinary person's life is lost. But I think that there are two kind of features to this question, other than that issue, that material issue. But one is that there would have not really been a broad awareness. Like today, we have this real conception of like your spiritual life and your religious life don't have to be the same. So a lot of people say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual or whatever. And that whole idea would have been pretty
Yeah.
incomprehensible to anyone in the Middle Ages. They'd have been like, what are you talking about? So I think that's one thing, is that the spiritual life and the religious life were pretty much one and the same. Um, and so to disentangle the corruption of the church from your
Mm.
spiritual life would have been very hard and complicated. And then I think, secondly, I do think that there was enough, there were still avenues of critiquing authority. And so there was an awareness like, okay, the church is corrupt and I can critique that. We get these reforming figures, but I don't know how much of that was in the consciousness of just the average, ordinary
Mm.
person, or whether that was, it might have been. It very well might have been, or it might have depended on who your parish priest was, and the ways that you were being taught. Was the church's power always just kind of accept it, take it, this is it?
Mhm.
Or was there some room within that that varied widely, I think, from place to place?
Yeah, because yeah, I think a lot of times when people look back, depending on their own beliefs around the institution of the church or of religion in general, they'll either see the church's power as like something really, really terrible, or something to be admired that we don't
Yeah.
have now
Yeah.
because we have that like separation of church and state. So
Absolutely. And I
yeah.
think you see that in like a lot of different political movements today where
Hmm.
some people have idolized that and built it up into this sort of nostalgic moment in history. Wouldn't it be great if religious power and governmental power were the same again?
Yeah.
Or you have the horror of no, never. So
No.
you really see that how we understand that is so much framed by our commitments and our and the things that we kind of maybe a little delusional about. So
Yes, totally. And one other thing that you write about in relation to like how we're different in modernity is just like this idea of holy fear, and
Mm.
fear as a motivator for like spiritual goodness. It was that like one of the things that when studying medieval people that you had a hard time understanding at first, or
Oh
what? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
definitely. No, I think for us today, or maybe just speaking for myself, the idea of fear as a motivator is deeply unattractive. I'm like,
Yes.
ugh, like I don't want to just make decisions because I'm afraid of something. But I think that actually, the more I got into this idea of holy fear, and undeniably it appears in the Psalms over and over, it appears in the Gospels. I mean, you have to reckon with an idea of holy fear if you start taking the language of scripture seriously. So then I was like, okay, well, I can't just be like, ew, I hate this, it has to go away. I have to figure out what to think about it. Um and so I think there's some really unhelpful ways of thinking about this. Acting out of trying to love one another out of terror of hell is not really going to get you that far. And I think you see that in the Middle Ages is that if folks are writing so much about hell and the terror of that, that's actually not the same as fear of God. What does it mean to be afraid of
Mm.
God? It's not actually the same as being afraid of hell. And so I began to think about just fear as this like actually all humans really need fear in order to live well because if we weren't afraid of things we should be afraid of like lions or the ocean or cliffs, these things that are amazing and beautiful and that we can adore but also keep a respectful distance while we are adoring, um that's actually part of our humanity is we know our littleness and we know that don't mess don't go swimming in the riptide. Like, don't overestimate your own abilities. That's going to be a problem. And I think that's more related. It's not quite the same. It's, again, metaphor doesn't do everything it needs to do. But this idea of, hey, you are limited. You do not know the ways of God. Like
Yeah.
anyone who's not holding on to that is going to speak for God in some pretty terrible ways. And so we see how righteousness is actually has to be related to a fear of God because you don't want to usurp the power and the holiness of God and conflate it with your own sense of that.
Yeah.
Because we've all seen how badly that can go awry. And I think that's one really productive and fruitful way of thinking about the fear of God is I should not conflate my littleness with that bigness. That is a dangerous thing for me.
Yeah. Or making God like so small that you could possibly understand
Exactly.
him. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Where you're like, we've all seen people do that. I mean, cult leaders, like,
Oh, yeah.
it happens all the time in many different ways, but that's a dangerous path for us to go down, both in terms of how we worship and in terms of who we are. And so the fear of God, where you go, "Oh, you are so much bigger and more powerful, and more everything than anything I can ever understand." That's going to keep us safe as we speak of holy things.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of my critique of modern spirituality or modern Christianity is that it feels so rosy and sanitized and like self-helpy that it's like, oh, like God just exists to like make you like be productive or I don't know, just like whatever that it feels like there should be some level of fear if you're going to have this inner transformation that this
Yes.
path is trying to get you to do. It is like terrifying and painful and awful sometimes. And it's interesting, like I didn't fully understand that until like this Christmas Eve. I had this like dream that it made me finally understand like what like fear of God meant in that way that you're talking about. And I had this dream that I was like talking to God like you would talk. I wrote about this on my Substack, but like I was talking to him like you would talk to a friend on the phone, and it was just so immediate and just that like close. And I remember thinking, wow, like this is so awesome. Like I felt so like confident and powerful in a way that I could do that. And then I said to him like, can you show me what like the show me your power because like I want to fully understand it. Like I'm ready. And he was like, okay. And I said, I want to fly. And immediately I started like levitating in the dream and just like shot up like 100 feet. And I just freaked out. And I in the dream I just shut my eyes and I said, I want to be back on the ground. And when I opened them, I was back on the ground. And in the dream I felt this deep feeling of regret. Like I wish I hadn't known because it was
Hmm.
so that power, like I just like this sense of a power that could just make me levitate 1,000,000 feet in the sky in the blink of a second was it was just so beyond, like I just knew that this was like the power that would just like it had the power to destroy me in a
Yeah.
sense. and
Yeah.
i and I remember feeling kind of ashamed when I woke up from that dream, like I was I, I didn't want to know, like I had this sense of like I just want to be comfortable and not know.
Yeah. Yeah. I relate to that. And I think like that's what remembering the judge helps us
Yeah.
with is that it's like, no, there's that invitation of like, it is good to be afraid in this proper way, not in a not in like a, oh, I'm too terrified to talk to God or I'm too whatever, but that you're like, you are so, so much bigger. And I have to hold that. I have to remember that because otherwise I will just put you in the little box and keep you safe
Exactly.
and that's good and I think the other thing with the fear of the Lord too that I think it cultivates a healthy fear and respect for other people because you're like if that God who can make who can just send you spiraling up into the air
Yeah.
um died for every other person, then you better be aware of how you are with every other person, even the horrible ones. That uh there's no good excuse for the ways in which we can treat each other. And I think that's the other aspect of why righteousness and fear of God are so tightly linked, is because there's this real humility with like, here I am with
Yeah.
all these people that God loves. And I, because the Lord is so much bigger than me, I have this moral obligation to love. And so
Yeah.
fear and love are linked in that way, which is hard for us to remember and understand.
It's hard, and it's also because the ironic thing is that so much is that righteousness born out of what you're describing can be used to gain power over other people in a
Yes,
really dark way. Like the
absolutely.
darkest forms of piety and religious
Yes.
life are born out of that.
Yes, out of that kind
Yeah.
of spiritual control. And that is
Yeah.
because either I think this person has morphed into a sort of terror of God and they're only acting out of terror and out of like control, or you don't have any fear of God because you've just made him exactly like yourself. And so,
Yeah.
um, so there's a lot of different paths, but that kind of the healthy fear of God is the healthy fear that is like, look at all these people made in God's image right here that I'm with, that I'm called to be in relationship with, or and look at God's immensity and how
Yeah.
merciful he has been. And that's, that's real.
Exactly. I think the image, the metaphor that I came with out of that dream was I felt like an ant standing in front of a tsunami wave. Like that was how small and powerless I felt. And it was a good thing, I think,
Mm.
because I think too often in our modern lives we feel like we should be powerful, like like we should know everything, and yeah, I find studying medieval people very very grounding and necessary. They're like our
Yeah.
opposites in a way.
Yeah.
And did has writing this book, has studying medieval people so much, has that changed you as a person?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think to some extent that's just like the human thing when you get deep into something, it's going to shape you no matter
Hmm.
what, right? Whether it's good or bad, it is going to shape who you are and how you respond to things. And so that's true on just a basic level. Um, and that's like why we so need like good and beautiful and truthful things to shape us. But then on a more uh, specific, I guess, level, I think they have helped me so much with just being more creative,
Hmm.
more uh more interested in metaphor, in how I shouldn't shut down possibilities for meaning. I need to keep listening, keep paying attention. Things will open up. Um and so I really appreciate how they've taught me in that way. And then I appreciate how reading people really different from you and from a different time and place are just going to challenge you. And so they challenge me. Like I go, oh, I don't like that very much, or oh, that makes sense to me. But that can't kind of when you're studying the past, that can't just be the dividing rule for whether or not um you like it or keep going. If you're studying the past, you have to take it all and you have to wrestle. And I think that's a really wonderful lesson and a wonderful way that they've shaped me is this invitation into wrestling where you're like, all right,
Yeah.
well, that's uncomfortable or that's more comfortable, but you know, what am I going to do?
Yeah, that comfort with discomfort or comfort
Yeah.
with uncertainty. I think that, yeah, it's a healthy dose of humility that brings to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a little bit of a time limit, but I'd just love to wrap it up if you could share anything that you're currently working on, or where people should look to find your work. I know you have a great Substack, and do you have any new books that are coming out in the near future?
I do. I have a book coming out. I forget whether it's September 8th or 9th. It's somewhere in there. That's called Ask of Old Paths, Medieval Virtues and Vices for a Whole and Holy Life. So it's continuing my medieval obsession, of course, but it's looking at these paired virtues and vices within this tradition of the seven capital vices and their virtue remedies. And so how they speak to each other, how they open each other up and help us think about what it means to live a virtuous life. This is something that is um, not exactly like a hot button way of thinking about living a good life in the world today. And I think that it's can be a really helpful resource for us as we think about what does it mean to be whole? What does it mean to live a whole life? And so that book is coming out in September. It's available for pre-order. And then I have a Substack. It's called Medievalish. It's gracehamman.substack.com. And my last name is like Hamman. It's kind of funny. It's not,
Yeah,
everyone spells
I'll
it
link
wrong.
everything so everyone can find it if they
Yeah,
if they don't
and
know how to
then
spell it.
exactly. And then I have a podcast called Old Books with Grace that just explores literature of the past with different guests who are various experts in their field, and that's a lot of fun too. So that's where you can find me online. Oh, I have a Instagram as well. So at Old Books with Grace.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for
Mm,
your thoughtful conversation. I really
yes.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Grace, for coming on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you did too. You can find more information about Grace on her website, gracehamman.com. Her last name is spelled Hamman. Her podcast is Old Books with Grace, which is where you can find her on Instagram. And her Substack, which I highly recommend reading, is Medievalish. Her book, once again, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. And as she mentioned, she has a new book on pre-order called Ask of Old Paths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time.